by step in understanding why this topic of discussion is important today. What is the significance? Then we dive into the discussion on what constitutes forced labor, and we need to understand also what is not a forced labor situation. So both these things become critical, and then we dive into the how to go about in addressing these issues in this changing, ever changing context we see in the business environment, right? So next please. So objectives of the program is that define forced labor and modern slavery and human trafficking. It is just maybe for some of you who are knowledgeable in this area, you may be knowing something about it or many things about it, but basically it is to rekindle or revise our understanding of these terms before we dive into other requirements and understand the legal compliance obligations with the changing environment, business environment. New legislations and regulations are coming up. Some regulations are impacting worldwide. Some regulations are country specific. Some regulations are region specific. So we need to understand how we are going to address these requirements as we go along and explore the practical risk mitigation tools. How are we going to address this? What are the avenues which are available, and what are those tools, mechanisms, frameworks, and possibilities of other interventions which could be done to address this and enable responsible business practices, what is expected out of it, and how we need to strengthen the existing systems and practices to address this. Right? Next, please. So the agenda, if we see, is introduction to key concepts first, legal and regulatory frameworks. We'll just look at what are those emerging regulations which we see and those requirements, an overview of that, and also to see risk indicators and due diligence and how we are going to address it with the due diligence tools and frameworks. And also we'll have some case studies or practical steps as I go along. This has been specifically put in case we have time, we can discuss on some of the cases. But as we go along, we will discuss some of those instances or reported cases so that it becomes easier for us to understand the concept as such. Then finally, we will have you have all been kept in mute throughout the program, and at the end of the program you can ask any questions on this, what you have, or any clarifications, and we'll try to answer them, and Zishan will coordinate and see to it that we are in a position to get answers for all our doubts so that it becomes a fruitful interaction at the end. Yeah, next please. So the case for action, why forced labor can't be ignored today. If we see that one of the issues, what we see is the poverty and economic hardship which is there, which some way is on the increase in some areas and some domains. At the same time, the economic hardship, maybe the price rise, political uncertainties, or what we call as the VUCA world, VUCA, that is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. In such a sort of a world, things are becoming harder for us, and this results in discrimination and inequality that some of the people are not able to have a good quality of life, and this results in them getting trapped into the forced labor situation. And the lack of social protection, as we see, every country has its own legislations on the social protection, perhaps to see to it that this is taken care of, and people are in a position to have certain amount of savings anytime when they leave the work, but this implementation on enforcement or the ability to get this protection is becoming challenging at some times. So that is one of the reasons why we discuss this topic. An abuse of power and control is seen in some parts and some industries, in some sectors, as we see that. For example, if we see the deep sea fishing in Thailand, we find considerable amount of forced labor situation existing, and the government has taken steps to address these. And if we look at the lack of access to justice, suppose someone is trapped in the forced labor situation, and by the means of interventions of the government, the regulatory authorities, or NGOs, if they are rescued, the access to justice and the subsequent steps for him or her to come back to part of the society, that itself is becoming a challenge. So that is why we discuss the forced labor issue today, which is gaining considerable significance. New business environment, if we see that outsourcing has become a new normal, where the production is outsourced, and the issues, if not in the organizations, are noticed significantly in the supply chains, maybe in tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3, at the in the whole of the supply chain, and hence it becomes important to address this issue. And migration and transition economy are those two things which we see today. One is the migration of workers from one region to the other region within the country, or from one country to the other. And this has become something common in today's context to eke out their livelihood. And transition economy, if we see that in today's context, we have a new economy coming up as a low carbon economy. So today climate change is a very big issue, and which is facing us. It's more of a crisis, and everybody is working on that. So the requirement of moving from the fossil fuel based economy to a renewable energy based economy requires considerable amount of a paradigm shift, if I may put it, to see to it that new materials, new processes are required. And this sort of a just transition, if I may put it, is resulting in issues like forced labor coming up in various sectors, particularly in the renewable energy sector and other sectors, which we will talk about it as we go along. So this is the case for action. So it's something, it cannot be brushed under the carpet. It is glaring at us, and it is there, and it is being masked by organizations and NGOs. And these issues are taken care of with greater understanding, and also the mechanisms which will have to be put in place, and also to see to it that how well or effectively we are in a position to address this issue, and should there be a case of a forced labor situation getting noticed, and because it has an impact on the reputation of the organization itself, so what steps are we required to take to see to it that we are in a position to address such situations, uncomfortable situations, and come back to normalcy over a period. So that is why this becomes very important. Next, please. So 21st century, what are the changes which we see in the way the business is run? Changes in the management models. If we look at it, it's not the same case as how the organizations were functioning, with the hierarchy of a chief executive sitting there with various vice presidents and presidents, and down below we have the managers and the workers, and that was the traditional model of doing business. Today, we have various models, management models are being thought of. For example, spaghetti organization. This is an organizational structure. Spaghetti, we know, is an Italian food and very common food. And the spaghetti organization essentially means a decentralized organization where people do multiple activities, the responsibilities are divided, and they are in a position to come up with the decision making according to the requirements. We have halocracy, we have lattice organization, and various other models which are there, wherein we are in a position to look at how the business environment is changing, and these models, when they will have to be implemented and they will have to be successful, require certain amount of systems and practices. And when challenges come in, of course the element of forced labor is likely to be there in such organizations. Second is that the requirement versus expectations. If we see in the earlier times, an organization which produces a product or a service, it was just that it should be having the capability to deliver what has been required and what has been asked, and they should be in a position to give a good quality of the product. But today, with the changing circumstances, it is but natural for the organizations to adapt themselves to these uncertainties, to these changing situations, and how effectively they are in a position to respond, and how effectively they are in a position to adjust to new normal. These are those things which are becoming of paramount importance rather than being a traditional organization to supply goods and services. So it is but natural that the strategy which the organization has to adopt also will have to be looked at when we see the changing business environment. And this, in a way, could result because of the race to the success, there can be situations of the forced labor creeping in. Third is that every one of us is reasonably familiar or at least have heard about the impact of ESG worldwide, environment, social, and governance model. And there are various frameworks, reporting frameworks, audits or verifications, and various other processes which happen in organizations. And within that, one of the central portion is the S factor, if I may call it, the social factor. And it becomes important for the organizations to address the social risks which they may have or which they anticipate to have in a proactive manner to see to it that steps are taken to address such risks. So, within that, the social component of addressing the labor rights and human rights and also the corporate social responsibility requirements, we have the element of the forced labor embedded into that. Demand for regulations and frameworks and standards, as we see every day, there are new standards and frameworks coming. The legislations are changing. For example, you have the Global Reporting Initiative as a sustainable reporting framework, which has been there for the past 25 years. And it is an established framework to bring in transparency and accountability to demonstrate to the stakeholders the steps they are taking to address the economic, environmental, and the governance requirement, or economic, environment, and ethical requirements followed by the organization, what we call as triple bottom E. We have those recent legislations like the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which has come up from the European Union, and it is likely to be put into force from the year 2026. So, this is going to be a new a game changer from 2026. And within that, the Sustainability Reporting Directive, we have the social component wherein the element of forced labor or other fundamental rights are also getting addressed. So it becomes important for the organizations to address the issue of forced labor within the ambit of the reporting directive. We have the Sustainability Assurance Standards Board, which is another framework similar to GRI, like country specific frameworks like BRSR. For example, in India, we have the Business Responsibility Sustainability Reporting, which is a framework for the Indian companies, the top 1,000 companies in India, which has been released by the government of India. If we look at Singapore, Singapore has its own the sustainability reporting framework, which wherein organizations with meeting certain requirements will have to abide by that, and it has become a law. Recently, Thailand has come up with a new framework for organizations to carry out the sustainability reporting. So when we see the changes which are happening, either they are becoming mandatory because of the regulations, or it is more like a voluntary initiative like GRI, which is slowly becoming or gaining significance and importance in the business environment. In other words, that without the reporting or disclosures being made with regard to transparency and accountability on various issues, it becomes very difficult to remain in the business for long. So transparency and accountability is getting stressed. As I indicated to you or discussed a little while ago about the climate change crisis, the climate change crisis is being addressed through Paris adjustment mechanism, which is there, or you know, the Paris mechanism, or what we call as the 2015, the Paris Agreement of common but differentiated responsibility, and moving from the fossil fuel based economy to the low carbon economy, where the transition, when we talk about the climate change, or when we talk about the climate change, there are two types of risks which we talk. One is the physical risk, and the other is the transition risk. Physical risks are those which we face because of extreme weather events, or the maybe the disturbance in the rainfall, or the failure of the rains resulting in food security issues, or rise of sea level, etc., etc. There is also the associated what we call as the transition risk, wherein the companies which are existing today may become irrelevant in the new economy, the low carbon economy. So somebody who is having a coal plant, he has to shut down. Somebody who is producing power with the fossil fuels may have to look for an alternative source to remain in business. So, when such a transition happens, obviously the people are the ones who are getting impacted. So, people are at the center, and if things change for the betterment or for good, what is required is that their rights are protected in the process. So that is what we call as the just transition, which is gaining considerable importance. And if you read any sort of a mechanism or a workshop, they have this just transition as a word inserted to see to it that everything related to the protection of rights is taken care of. So finally, why we need to look at the forced labor in this 21st century is that it is not a choice, but it is a mandate. And it is essential that we look at it carefully to see to it that we are in a position to address the issue in an effective manner in our organizations. Right. Next, please. Zishan. Yeah. So just to give the current statistics of the situation, what is there. To reinforce what we are discussing, it's about 50 million people are impacted by the modern slavery as ILO gives the statistics, and it's highest in Asia, Pacific, and Africa, as you can see. And it is common in agriculture, construction, apparel. Of course, other industries are also there, the emerging industries. If we look at, for example, what we call as the sunrise industries, biotech, or IT services, or other new type of the services of delivery to home like Amazon and other services which are being rendered, this is becoming common and an increased level of the issue which requires intervention. And when we look at the interactive world map chart, we are in a position to understand what is the gravity of the problem and why this requires attention today. Next, please. Zishan. Just to have more statistics, if we see that, yeah. So when we look at some of this thing, the age levels, the sectors, and the statistics, it is glaring, and the facts and figures which are provided by ILO indicates, next please, that we are in a position to get figures of this, like 60 countries are ratified the ILO forced labor protocol, 236 billion US dollar generated as illegal profits. So this itself is an indicator of why this has significance in today's business context and why this will have to be curbed, because these are illegal profits cornered by various agencies in the supply chain. Yes, next. Yeah, 63% of forced labor happens in private company. So when we look at it from the state-owned organizations and also the private organizations, this is a major problem which is noted in the private companies. Yes, next. Yeah. So as I indicated to you earlier, it is to the tune of 27.6 million men, women, and children who are impacted by this issue of forced labor or who are the victims of forced labor. I mean, this is just a figure. It could be 20% more, which is there. And this has been arrived at by ILO. So we are in a position to really understand the gravity of the situation and the necessity to address this issue. Yeah, next. So with a broad view of why this is important and why it is even more critical in this 21st century, let's discuss the definition of forced labor, which most of us may know, or at least we would have heard it somewhere, that all work or service which is extracted from any person under the menace of any penalty for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. So going through this, there are four important words which will have to be taken into consideration to understand the concept of forced labor. All work or service. So it doesn't mean there is an exclusion. It can be production, it can be distribution, it can be transportation, it can be just your cleaning, housekeeping activity, whatever it is, work or service. So this is that every activity will have to be taken into consideration, which is extracted from any person. So when we say any person, it could be a child, it could be women, it could be men, it could be a migrant worker, seasonal worker, casual worker, temporary worker, or a paid hourly paid worker, whoever it is, any person. And the third important word is that under the menace. So menace of any penalty. Penalty could be in terms of financial withholding of payments, it could be threat, it could be coercion, it could be physical abuse, it could be sexual abuse, whatever it is, the menace and any penalty. And the last one is that the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. So that means things are being taken for granted and there is no consent of the person. So what becomes important is that the consent which has to be obtained from the worker, that becomes of paramount importance. So that is why when we look at any organization, the importance of appointment letter or appointment order, whatever be the term we use, it becomes very important, wherein we are in a position to get an evidence of the consent of the person who has agreed to carry out certain activity. It could be a transportation activity, it could be a production activity, it could be tailoring, or it could be housekeeping activity, whatever it is, whether the consent is there, that is obtained through the consent of the appointment letter or acceptance of the appointment letter. So this is the basic definition of the forced labor. And when we come to the modern slavery, if we look at the term modern slavery in international the human rights law, if we see that there is no definition of the modern slavery which has been given. But however, how it has been termed is that the extreme exploitation, yeah, other form of forced labor, extreme exploitation, heavy dependency of the person on the organization, and cannot refuse the job or leave the job because of the mechanisms, because they are isolated or the conditions are such that they cannot leave the organization under any circumstances, or they are confined to the organization boundaries, and various other steps are being taken should they leave the organization, or through threats and coercion, violence, sometimes deception or abuse of power. If all these sort of situations prevail, that gets termed as a modern slavery. So it's an umbrella term encompassing practices of forced labor, or it could be human trafficking, or it could be debt bondage, where individuals are exploited due to threats, violence, coercion, deception, the means of doing it, abuse of power, making it impossible for them to refuse or leave. So when we look at the key aspects, there are four key aspects as we discuss. Next, Zishan. Yeah. Forced and compulsory. We have understood that. Menace of penalty, lack of voluntary offer, and the scope applies to all types of work or service. This is what little while I explained to you about the definition of forced labor. Next, please. So let's come to one of the forms of modern slavery as we discuss human trafficking. Human trafficking is a global crime that trades in people for profits with exploitation. So the sole purpose of human trafficking is just exploitation. So if it is with a purpose of giving employment, seeing that the lifestyle changes or the quality of life changes, and it is within the domain of the prescribed legal requirements or regulations, then it becomes migration. So there is only a thin line, if we look at it, which divides between migration and the human trafficking. As we see, the act, means, and purpose. The act is transfer of people, means is transporting them from one place to other, purpose is to give a meaningful employment so that the person could earn a living, then it can be considered as migration. It is not human trafficking. But if the act is with force, coercion, threat, and the means of transporting whatever is there from one place to other is the illegal transportation, what happens, or harboring, as we say, the purpose is basically for exploitation. So, if that being the case, then it becomes a human trafficking situation. The Palermo Protocol, that is, Palermo is a place in Italy. In 2000, they came up with a document called as the Palermo Protocol, which talks about prevention, suppression, and also punishment of trafficking persons, and especially women and children. So the emphasis is given on women and children, and this came into existence as the Palermo Protocol in the year 2000. November 15, 2000 was when it was adopted, and that has become a norm to address the issue of human trafficking in organizations. So remember that the act, means, and purpose, that is the one which decides on whether it is trafficking or whether it is not a human trafficking. Migrant smuggling and human trafficking is another issue which we see today, that migrant smuggling is all the smuggling of people from one country to other illegally, and telling them that they will have a good quality of life in the other country and their employment will be conditions will be taken care of, and they may get uh, 10 times more income from whatever is being earned. So all these sort of statements are given, or sometimes they are threatened or coerced, and then they are smuggled from one country to other. If we see, for example, a situation which we see in South Korea, there is a clear case of what we call as ghost workers. Interesting thing is the ghost workers. Ghost workers are known as Phai Noi, Phinoi in the Thai language. They are called as little ghosts. These are those illegal workers who are transported from Thailand to South Korea, and they are promised 9 to 10 times the salary what they will get in South Korea, and they are forced to work at very high working hours, no insurance, harsh conditions, everything making them something as slaves, or what we call as the modern slaves. So that is the situation which we see like in migrant smuggling and human trafficking in many of the organizations in many countries. No industry or country is immune to human trafficking. This is something very important, as we see that it is happening only in less developed countries, or least developed countries. That is not the case. No country is immune. Everywhere, whether it is very much developed country or a developing country or underdeveloped country, this issue of human trafficking prevails. And no industry, when we look at it, it is not that an IT industry is much better because everything is in the air conditioned space, or the activities which are done in the mine is where human trafficking takes place. Nothing like that. Every industry, there is an issue of human trafficking which prevails either within the organization or in the supply chain. The last is, one fundamental question comes is that what if the traffic person consents? Because if I don't have any work here and my country is in trouble and I have no job potential here, and so much of conflict happening in the country, I would like to get out of the country and get a job. So I sign the contract or give a consent that yes, I can be trafficked or I can be taken from one country to other. That being the case, is it acceptable? That is a fundamental question, right? Many a times when we talk to the workers or people who have been trafficked. No, no, we accepted the conditions what were laid down, and that is why we are here. So under those conditions, situations, if the process is for exploitation only, then it is not at all acceptable. So what becomes important is that the consent, whatever is obtained from the victim, cannot be considered as an excuse to say that they have not been trafficked. So this is something which will have to be taken into consideration when we address the issue of human trafficking. Of course, it is a menace, it is a bane for the society, and unfortunately, this is something prevailing and it is on the increase as we see from the media reports or from the social media, and also from the legal perspective. Many cases are being fought, and that is why, for example, in this case of the situation where the migrant workers case in palm oil industry in Malaysia, so there have been considerable amount of exploitation of migrant workers which have been there and they have been trafficked, and this is in the court of law for justice. So many of these situations which are there, so what we call as push factors and pull factors for human trafficking is there. Considerable amount of push factors as why they are being trafficked or why they fall as victim to human trafficking is there, and also pull factors. What is it that makes the people attractive to get trafficked, and what is it that they expect to have as a benefit in by getting trafficked? Though they know that they are being trafficked, they subject themselves to this process, but ultimately get exploited over a period. All these things are available. They are on the increase, the push factors and pull factors, because of the changing societal requirements and the socio-economic situations prevailing in countries. And that is to be taken into consideration when we study the topic of human trafficking. So it's a very big topic by itself, but the objective here is to make you understand that this is something which is to be curbed, prevented, stopped, or suppressed in whatever way possible, to see that the rights of the workers are the rights of the people are protected. Yeah, next. So ILO has come up with the indicators to say, as we saw the definition of the forced labor, ILO has come up with certain indicators what constitutes forced labor. Some of the things we have seen, like of abuse of vulnerability. For example, if people are illiterate and they are not in a position to know the conditions of working, and they are being taken for a job and they are being exploited, that becomes an indicator for that. Deception, if we see that somebody is promised that you will be a sales supervisor in a car showroom and you are given employment for that, and this person reaches the organization and he's asked to clean the cars and see to it that he does the housekeeping work there. This is deception, an example of deception. I'm just trying to give some examples so that the indicators are well understood by you. Restriction of movement. For example, if we look at our labor laws, always there is a provision given for lunch hour or for breaks, etc., and various other things. Why? It's basically that they are free to move around, and it is they are not tied to the work station for 8 hours from 9 to 5. So they will have to have the freedom to move. But if these are restricted, then it becomes an indicator of forced labor. For example, in some of the garment companies where there are targets set for per day production or to meet the demand of the clients, the workers are not even allowed to use the washroom. And if they are using the washroom, they will be permitted for 2 minutes. Otherwise, their half a day salary will be cut. So, such sort of conditions were noted in some of the industries which have been reported, and these are blatant violations of the requirements, and that constitutes the restriction of movement. The restriction of movement also indicates that suppose if the 8 hour work is completed by the worker or by the people, the employee, he or she is free to move or leave the premises of the company. If they are kept for whatever reason, then it constitutes forced labor. Because this happens in some of the companies where they have dormitories set up and they are not allowed to move out from the dormitories, and they have to be there for 6 months or 8 months till their contract requirements are finished. So this becomes an issue of restriction of movement. Isolation, as we see, that they are kept separately without mingling with anyone, and they just do the work and then go to their premises, and they can't meet anyone, they can't discuss with anyone, they can't use WhatsApp or whatever be the social media. For 6 months they are kept in isolation. So that is an indicator of the forced labor situation. Physical and sexual violence, we understand that the physical violence we have seen in some of the countries like in Myanmar, where the workers are beaten if they do not follow the requirements of the military rule state. So, such things are common in some of the industries and some of the countries. So, that is rather a violation of the rights, blatant violation of the human rights, and that constitutes forced labor. In fact, Myanmar, because of the forced labor situation only, was under the lens of ILO, and they had to do considerable amount of investigation to see to it that things are brought to some level before permitting them to be within the business arena. And intimidation threats, we understand. Retention of identity and documents. This is something common. We see the confiscating the passports or identity cards and keeping them with the work with the organization, and they don't allow the people to go out, or they don't give till the work is completed. So such things are sometimes noted, particularly with migrant workers when they move from one country to other. Withholding of wages, many a times because the workers may leave after the work is completed or even before the contract situation is there. So they withhold certain bonus or their own wages, and what we call as the contractors call it as a runaway insurance. It is just an insurance, the money which is kept to see to it that they don't run away from work. So they just keep the last month's pay to see to it that the workers will not move away or the employees will not leave the company. That is, withholding of wages is directly an indicator of the forced labor. Debt bondage, we understand, that is that a heavy loan is taken by the employees with heavy interest, and they cannot complete the loan, and their own family members or other people will have to continue with the work. So such situations we don't see commonly in the organized sector, but in brick kiln industries, in some of the industries like the service sector or agriculture. So this debt bondage is even existing today. Abusive working and living conditions, no need to explain that. And they are people are treated like cattle, and they are asked to work in a miserable situation. So that itself is a forced labor situation because they cannot leave the premises before completion of the contractual relationship. Excessive overtime, this is something which we see in most of the organizations because of the demand to produce, meeting the client requirements, and they are forced to do overtime. So, forced overtime, if we see that on one side, the overtime is beneficial to employees or workers, that it gives more income and they are in a position to spend their time, maybe migrant workers, because they don't have much activity, they don't have a home or anything, they will be happy to do the work, and that is a benefit to the organization. And the overtime, in a way, it also helps in increasing the production levels of the organization, obviously increase in profits for the organization. But the flip side is that this has a lot
Absolutely,
of impact
Amish.
on the workers, the health of the workers, and also to see to it that these are impacting the workers' life. So that becomes a indicator of forced labor. So we are in a position to really understand what constitutes forced labor and what can be the indicators if we have to judge a situation when we go to an organization or an industry or a setup. What constitutes forced labor? When we are in a position to understand these indicators, it becomes easier for us to judge. There may be prevalence of forced labor in such an environment where we are visiting, right? Next. So, to address these things, issue of forced labor, ILO has come up with conventions, Convention 29, which defines what constitutes forced labor, and 105 as what is the way to abolition of forced labor across the industries. And this is still there, and this is the basic document based on which the national regulations or the laws of the land are being made in the respective countries. So these conventions, as all of us understand, they have to be ratified, in other words accepted by the respective members of ILO. And once ratification process happens, then the organization is supposed to come up with the regulations within their respective countries and also report the details to ILO about the progress which has been made in that area. But in this case of forced labor, because this becomes a fundamental right of the workers, obviously, whether they ratify or they do not ratify, it becomes important for every country to give a report on what are those mechanisms available, what are those regulations available in the respective countries to address the forced labor, and how effectively they are being implemented, and what are those challenges and how they are planning to overcome, what is the strategy they have to address this. These are all the requirements which will have to be fulfilled by the respective members who are the members of ILO. We have from 2015 the UNGP principles, the 31 principles which are there for business, which is being followed by most of the organizations, and that has become the norm of the day. If we look at what we call as the Ruggie principles, John Ruggie, who came up with protect, respect, and remedy, what we call as the PRR, protect. It is the responsibility of the state to protect the human rights, and it is the responsibility of the business to respect the rights. And should there be a problem either with the state or with the organization, the business, then remedial measures must be there. In other words, if there are any grievances and issues cropping up in the process of protection of these rights, then it is but natural for the either the state or the business to take some remedial measures to set right the situation. So this is the UNGP is based on the protect, respect, remedy, John Ruggie principles, which is being taken into consideration as a part of responsible business in most of the organizations. And forced labor is an element which is embedded into this. OECD due diligence guidelines for multinational enterprises or MNEs gives a clear way or clear path of looking at the issues of protection of rights through what we call as the human rights due diligence process. And it is very well detailed at most of the organizations, leading organizations and multinational organizations base their mechanism of monitoring through the OECD due diligence guidelines. And we have also reporting frameworks, which little while ago what we discussed about the GRI Global Reporting Initiative or
আগামী থেকে
integrated reporting
এসআর কাউন্টার
or other reporting
ভাইয়া
frameworks
কালকে
which are there,
আগামীকালকে থেকে তো
so which
টিকিট
are in a
ছাড়বে, তো কটা
position
থেকে
to,
টিকিট ছাড়বেন আপনারা?
yeah, you have to mute Zishan. Yeah. So these are some of the frameworks which are available for us to see to it that how well the issue can be addressed in the international legal frameworks. Next, please. Then we have the modern slavery laws which have come up. One of the first laws which came up was in UK, UK Modern Slavery Act 2015. Subsequently, Australia came up with a regulation as Modern Slavery Act 2018. Canada came up with Fighting the Forced Labor Act. US in California, we have the California Transparency Act. EU, European Union Supply Chain Law of 2022 addresses the issue of forced labor. And Japan, for example, has guidelines for respecting the human rights and responsibility of supply chains. So we see considerable amount of the initiatives which are being taken by the respective countries, and the respective countries define what constitutes modern slavery and how an organization will have to take care or address these issues of modern slavery. By and large, when we see what is expected out of these legislations is that when we see, we're not going into the uh, issues or the elements of this legislation, but by and large, what it says is that one is to the company has a policy addressing modern slavery. The company is in a position to monitor the policy requirements, and it is in a position to come up with transparently reporting the issues which have been noted, and it is disclosed. So in other words, it must be available on the website or it must be publicly available on what steps they have taken to address the issue of modern slavery. Maybe from 2026 or 2030, with the European legislation coming up for the various products, Europe, any other countries within the European Union will not accept any products which have been produced through forced labor at any step of the process of production. So this is something which is very important, that this issue will have to be taken into consideration through ways and means to address them in a way which is practical, in a way which is transparent, in a way which makes things accountable for the organization to demonstrate that the organizations are in a position to address the issue of the modern slavery, what is prevailing today. Yeah, next. So high risk sectors, we have talked about some of these sectors, the garment and textiles, which is labor intensive, electronics, agriculture, and because in agriculture it's maybe seasonal, and many of the things happen through contract workers or temporary workers, so it's the possibility of exploitation prevails, and many of the times a group of people move from one area to the other area when it is agriculture season for seeding or for harvesting, and these are those situations where the issue of the forced labor happens or victims of forced labor are noted. And construction and domestic work, domestic servitude is another issue which is being noted by ILO, and regulations are being made to address this. There is a high dependence on migrant and informal labor, what we discussed today. So, what becomes important is that it is said that the migrant workers are 3 times vulnerable to a forced labor situation than the local people. In other words, because they do not know the language, because they are not familiar with the culture, because their only objective is to earn when they are there in the country or during the contractual period. So, what happens is that the exploitation becomes exponential. So, that is why there is a high dependence on migrant and informal labor. Whatever, when it is noted, obviously that is a pointer to the case of prevalence of child labor. It is a possibility that the forced labor situation could be there in the organizations. Lack of oversight increase vulnerability. In other words, it is not that these are all the only sectors where these are high risk sectors. If it is a lack of oversight or which is there in other sectors, they also equally could be considered as high risk sectors. Could be hospitality, could be service sector, where activities are being done. It could be transportation sector. So depending on the country, depending on the nature of business, the high risk sectors may vary from one sector to other. So this is just an indication of where all this situation is likely to happen. Yeah, next. So red flags to watch for, we have already indicated or discussed the indicators. Now, what are the red flags? Immediately, how do we come to know of the prevalence of forced labor? If we see that withheld passports and ID benefits, recruitment fees and debt bondage. So this is a big problem when people go for work. The brokers or the agents, they charge a hefty fees. For example, in the case, this is a recent case which happened in September 2024 in Malaysia, in a company called as Kawagachi, which was producing plastic screens and plastic components for Japanese companies, Sony, Panasonic, Daikin, and others. Now, it so happened the abusive conditions in that Kawagachi resulted in the people working for 24 hours without break, being paid lower than the minimum wage. That is not obeying the legal requirements and also working in abusive conditions. When this came to light, the as we discussed earlier, the Japanese responsible business code, based on that, they stopped the orders to this company. So this happened sometime in December, January this year. Now all the people are without a job. The company is closed. Now where do these people go? Migrant workers. They go to the nearby port area and see whatever job they can get, and they are trying to survive there. But what is important is that 70% of the workers, 70% of the workers who are working in that company, they pay 50% of their wages, 50%, half of their wage to the recruiter for as a fees. So we can understand the real problem of these recruitment fees, and if they are not paid, and they will be taken to task. That is clear. So obviously it becomes a debt bondage for them, and the recruitment fees is becoming a very, very big issue today. So that is why some of the ethical recruitment standards are being brought out, as we see the IRIS, Integrated Responsibility, the integrity standard, International Registered Integrity Standard, or IRIS standard, which has been brought out by IOM. And this standard for ethical recruitment is gaining importance in situations where the people are recruited from one country to other, or the migrant workers are recruited. Precarious employment is something which is a red flag. Precarious employment essentially meaning that there is no appointment letter, nothing at all. They are asked to work, and whatever the wages the company can give, they are being given, and no social protection, nothing at all. Now, if we see, for example, the GOT standard, some of the this thing, Global Organic Textile Standard, some of you may be familiar with it. The version 7 clearly talks about the precarious employment, which has to be avoided. So precarious employment results in people becoming victims of forced labor in the respective organizations. Restricted freedom of movement, we discussed, high overtime levels, worker demographics. That is also a red flag, in the sense we go to a company, it has 90% migrant workers. For example, if we go to a palm oil industry in Malaysia, most of the palm oil cultivations, they are employing only the migrant labor from Bangladesh, Nepal, India, or other Asian countries. So this is a red flag. We need to see whether they are really migrant workers, or they have been trafficked to do the work, and what are their contractual conditions, whether they know the language and how their rights are protected. Otherwise, they may be exploited. So these are some of those red flags we are in a position to understand, and then accordingly do an investigation, do a verification, or do a checking in the supply chain. The industry specific issues are there. Specific industries, if we see that there could be situations which demand attention to, and these will have to be taken to in the context, in the organization, and also in the respective countries, which we have to see. Right? Next, please. So, how do we address, for example, before we go to the situation on how do we address this modern slavery, if you see today, one of the biggest requirement is the what we call as the rare earths or transition minerals. The transition minerals, like cobalt, nickel, lanthanum, and other elements which are there, they are increasingly being used for either the circuits in automotive companies, or making of batteries, or into the low carbon economy. For example, renewable energy sources, for production of renewable energy products. Now, these, for example, cobalt, if we see, 70% of cobalt is from one country, that is the Democratic Republic of Congo, an African country. And if you see these cobalt mining, these are very shallow mines, that is 10 feet below the ground, and not much of space at all for mining this. And they will have to crawl around the, the mine, and at the end of the day, they come out after traveling maybe few kilometers below the ground and coming out, and they get a meager sum for as a wage. Now, this resulted in considerable amount of children being exploited. So it becomes a worst form of child labor, that is child labor plus forced labor situation. And obviously, this took the attention of the world, and now they have come up with an initiative to curb this problem. So minerals, if you, for example, what they call as conflict minerals regulation has come up, especially to look at the traceability of where the minerals have come in. And these are all some of those industry specific issues what I was talking to you little while ago. Now, how do we address this forced labor situation? Number one is that human rights due diligence process, what we discussed little while ago about the OECD guidelines or the document which indicated the three principles. And human rights due diligence is likely to become very important. It is going to take a center stage because to address the supply chain related issues from 2026 when the European Union regulations are put into force. And just because of this importance, we from GSUK, we are just contemplating or planning to come up with a program for capacity building, a 2 days program on certified human rights due diligence professional. So we may launch it sometime later, depending on when GSUK decides. And I would urge all of you who are interested to attend the program and get certified as certified human rights due diligence professional, which may be useful in your career also. Second is the responsible recruitment, as we talked about the ethical recruitment requirements, which will have to be taken into consideration by the organization or following the principle of sustainable procurement process based on ISO 2400, which talks about the sustainability related issues. So this is something which will have to be taken into consideration. And each of these things we will quickly go through for a better understanding. And grievance and workers' voice, we understand that should there be any issues with regard to the workers' grievances or any concerns, there must be mechanism to for them to address it, and the workers' voice can be heard by the management so that they can be in a position to be addressed. Of course, the systems, procedures, audits, and reviews, and some of us may be familiar with this, and these become very important to come up with a review of the existing systems, processes, and also the procedures so that they can be monitored through audits or other means to ensure that the forced labor or the modern slavery issue can be addressed. Technology assistance today is available and it is on the increase with all these artificial intelligence and various other tools, the power of internet that can be used to address the modern slavery. Quickly, we'll go through each of these points how modern slavery issues, the burning issue of modern slavery can be addressed. Next, please. So in human rights, due diligence is a 7-step process with a commitment to policies. The company is committing itself to take into consideration of protecting the human rights, not only within the organization, but in the supply chain, and within which the protection comes the forced labor or the modern slavery or human trafficking issues. Next is risk assessment. We need to know which area or which supply chain may have the risk of the social risk of the violation of human rights. Once we are in a position to understand the areas or the locations or the steps in the supply chain where the possibility of violation may be there, the next thing is to give them training and capacity building. So the supply chain must understand why these steps are being taken, what is the objective behind it, and it cannot be put under duress that they are asked to follow certain requirements. Otherwise, the escape route is what they choose. So what has to be done is to see to it that they are properly trained and the capacity building process happens in the supply chain, so that the mitigation and prevention can be taken into consideration through systems, policies, and procedures. And of course, monitoring and tracking becomes very important. And in case there are pain points, that is, every organization in the supply chain may have certain ifs and buts, that we cannot do that because of certain resource constraints, we cannot do that because of infrastructure constraints, it could be because of other resources not being available. So if these pain points are identified and a practical response is taken by the organization, it becomes easier for public reporting. So this is a 7-step process. If we look at, for example, a standard like global organic textile standard, which I referred earlier, they have brought in this element of human rights due diligence in the newer version. So similarly, other standards or frameworks are also taking this into consideration, and this is likely to become a mandate from 2026, as I indicated to you earlier. Yeah. Next, if we see that, we have the responsible recruitment. As I discussed about the IRIS standard, which is gaining prominence, adopt employer pays model. It is not the contractor or the recruiter who pays that, the employer pays model. Ban recruitment fees for workers. This is preventing such a sort of the forced labor situation happening. As I gave you little while ago, the example of Kawagachi. Screen labor brokers carefully, and of course the choice of it becomes important. The fair and equitable practices, justified practices, and what is to be taken into consideration legally, and also what is practiced by the industry as benchmarking practices to be adopted, and also the ethical hiring tools. So there are various nowadays with all these platforms for hiring. There are software tools and other things available which could be put to use to enable the responsible recruitment, so that the risk of the forced labor is minimized, not only in the organization but in the supply chain. Yeah. Next. This is very well understood, the requirement of anonymous complaint mechanism, workers hotlines and feedback. Many a times organizations have some of these things outsourced to other agencies so that it is transparent. NGO union and partnership, that also helps some ways and ensure the remedy and follow up. So we talked about the requirement of remedy when we talked about the UNGP principles. So this is something which has to be taken care of by the organization to prevent the incidents or control the incidence of forced labor. Yes, please. Leveraging technology like supply chain mapping, traceability tools like blockchain. Nowadays, blockchain like Hyperledger Fabric or other tools can be used for addressing the supply chain issues. Mobile apps, these are known. AI powered risk assessment. Some of the organizations use the AI to look at the incidence of child labor based on the information what is there, what cannot be captured by the human analysis. AI may be able to identify it and throw up for the actions to be taken, that is there. IoT devices and sensors, if they are installed, for example, if IoT sensor is installed on an equipment, and whenever it works, obviously it is going to record that. So we are in a position to easily identify how many hours the machine has worked, whether there was overtime, how many people worked, and every other thing can be monitored through that. The productivity levels can be monitored. Digital identity verification systems to identify whether people were working overtime or not, how many hours of work, what is the nature of work, everything can be monitored. Remote sensing and drone technology sometimes is used in mines, in agricultural fields, to see that how many people are really working there, and they are in a position to identify whether they are confined, they are allowed to move, and all those indicators which we discussed can be monitored through the technology. And predictive analytical tools are available with which the forced labor situation can be identified, or possibility of incidents happening can be noted. So technology now provides a good solution, and it is for us to see to it that how well this technology can be integrated into the business process, to see to it that these issues can be addressed. Not only the forced labor issues, it can help in other ways also. Yeah, next. Tools and resources. We understand some of the standards which we discussed earlier, the SEDEX, AMFORI, BSCA Business Social Compliance Initiative is there from Europe. Stronger Together by Verite, it is another framework. Know the Chain benchmarks is there. ILO help desk is available for any sort of information, and there are also other frameworks and standards, right? So we have considerable amount of tools and resources to really understand, to dive deep, and also to really know what are those emerging issues coming up and how we need to address these. So sources are available. Yes, please. So positive business case, as we see that global brands are eliminating worker fees, as we see, and supplier engagement through training is something which is being given attention to by many organizations. Policy revision and compliance checks are gaining importance. Transparency in reporting is now one of the things which will have to be taken care of, because mandatory reporting is likely to come up from next year onwards because of the European legislations or even legislations from other countries. So this is something which is seen as a positive steps which are being taken in the area of forced labor and also addressing issues like human trafficking. Yes, please. So NGO partnership, we discussed little while ago. The traceability tools for risk mapping is there. Capacity building can be done by them. Joint impact on reducing forced labor. It is more of a coordinated effort of this complicated issue is what is being talked about through the partnerships and also the NGO interventions. Yes, please. Yeah. So what's holding? In spite of all this, what is the problem now with addressing this forced labor? Because the economics comes before the social component. Cost pressures and business incentives, they will have to be weighed. Weak legal enforcement, some of the countries have very weak legal enforcement, and that is also resulting in this issue. Lack of supply chain transparency, we have been talking about it. Inadequate monitoring mechanisms, poor reporting practices and procedures, which is likely to change from next year. Management commitment to address this menace. So commitment and concern becomes of paramount importance in addressing the issue of forced labor. Yes. Yeah. So key takeaways finally, forced labor is real, widespread. So we have understood it's there in every, as I indicated to you, in every component of the economy or every industry. Business must act proactively. So that's what is important. Due diligence reduces legal and ethical risks. We talked about the framework, and also empower workers and review supply chains. So capacity building and also making people aware of this so that they are in a position to report any of the issues that is to be taken care of by the organizations. Yes, please. So we have additional resources which are there, plenty of resources. A few of them are just indicated to you. These are all reports, country-specific modern slavery reports, UNGP guidelines, ILO indicators of forced labor are available, which can be referred to for better understanding of the issue of forced labor. Yes, please. Yeah. So call for action, review the supply chain, audit and engage the suppliers, train the staff and commit to ethical recruitment, which we have been emphasizing and re-emphasizing throughout our discussion, right? Next. Yeah. Yeah. So that I think finishes the discussion. I've been a little bit slow and but wanted to give as much information as possible so that you are clear with the topic what we are discussing, and I hope it could it helped you understand things better. Welcome any questions now. Yeah, anybody has any questions?
If anybody have a question, just raise your hand.
No questions.
Okay, we'll wait for a minute or so. I think they all fully understand it.
Okay, good.
Good. Okay. So, yeah, thank you very much. Oh, there might be some questions.
Yeah, please.
Hannah.
Hi everyone. So my question is that how we will respond to the great requirements. There is quite an upsurge from the brands that there should not be any restrictions of movement, no overtime. So in terms of the policy and implementation context, can you just provide a brief overview? What should be the takeaway, what should be the managers or the compliance professionals should be doing to avoid any situation like that?
Yeah, good question. Basic thing is what is being expected out of this process is that it is not that things get rectified overnight. What is expected is that the company has a strategy, view of things existing, the baseline is clear, and what are those pain points which they will have to address is absolutely clear to the company, and what sort of efforts, practical efforts, they will be in a position to take over a period which is with a what we call as a smart objective in the ISO terms will have to be taken into consideration by the organization, and this has to be addressed. So it is not a one day solution which can be arrived at. It may take months, sometimes years, but what is more important is that to see to it that it has various factors like a cultural factor is there. There are other constraints related to the organization, but within the constraints, how the organization is able to commit itself on this issue and what sort of concern it has on this and how they are coming up with efforts to do that through a strategic way is what is being looked at by the brands. I
Thank you
hope I
very
am clear.
much.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's almost end of the session. So at the end, thank you very much everyone for joining this session, and once again, thanks Murli for the insightful session. It was really helpful. So just some information that this session will be available on our YouTube channel. It will be available within a week from today. So if there is someone who joined the session late or they missed some sections, they can easily download it. They can easily view it on the YouTube channel. Also, all of you must have received an email from Zishan. Zishan is the admin and he is the right person to contact. So if you have any specific requirements, any training needs, or anything that you want to know about GS UK, please feel free to contact him. You can also join our LinkedIn page and all upcoming training courses, they will be announced there. The next training course will be on SBTI, and we will announce it shortly, so you can check it on our LinkedIn page. So thank you very much. Anything else, Anna?
No, that's it. Thank you
That's
very
it.
much, everyone, and you'll be receiving your certificate very soon. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
Thank
much.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you all once again for attending this
Thank
session.
you.
Thank
And
you.
also thank you, special thanks to Henna and Tanveer for making this happen. And we have had a sizable number of people, and I hope they benefited from this and hope to see you sometime. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Murli. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Bye
everyone.
bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for the great training.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're most welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
You're most welcome.